Hey, what's up, y'all? Welcome to another episode of the Heart and Hustle podcast with Dr. Martinez. Yes, myself. Yes, this is the very first solo episode on the Heart and Hustle podcast. That is due to having to reschedule with the amazing Kenya Juarez because of the weather conditions and due to some changes within our schedules. But I'm still excited to get Kenya to join me and for her to have an opportunity to share her inspirational, motivational, and just empowering story. But until then, I figured that I would keep the ball rolling, not lose momentum, and continue to create content. For this episode, I'm going to do something a little bit differently. And for this episode, I want to share that of my grandmother's story, Tomasa Garcia. Tomasa Garcia was born December 28, 1938, in Central America. She was born in El Salvador and grew up in a town, city, village known as San Miguel. Growing up, my grandma was really big in telling me stories of what it was like her growing up in El Salvador. Oftentimes, these stories highlighted the extreme poverty that her and her family navigated, experienced, and the challenges that came along with that extreme level of poverty. Due to that poverty, my grandmother reached the point in her life after having had children, after having to have dropped out of school and dedicated her life to providing financial support for her family, that she no longer felt like it was sustainable to be in El Salvador, to raise her children, and to have anything even close to a happy life. Due to this, my grandmother, like many from similar conditions and similar countries, she made the decision of leaving everything that she knew, y'all. Her family, which included her children, which included my mom, her friends, her home, her language, everything, in pursuit of that of the American dream. My assumption is that at some point, folks are told about the US, about the opportunities that exist over here, and it gives them a sense of hope that perhaps if they're able to come to the US and then build a foundation for themselves, they can bring their families one day and then be living in the midst of that American dream that I'm sure they believed would include financial wealth, would include a healthier, safer environment than that of which they were able to exist within in their home countries. Some examples of things that my grandma shared having to navigate an experience in El Salvador include that of having to drop out of school in the third grade because her mom really needed her support with selling tortillas at the market. So my grandma had to leave her education, not because she wanted to, because she nor her family could really afford for her to keep going to school and to provide for the other siblings that my grandmother also had. My grandma shares with me what it was like to have children and to be living again in extreme poverty, and this approach that they took to feeding their children, which included water with sugar because they couldn't afford milk. She shared with me having had two babies pass away because she didn't have access to healthcare. And she didn't have the resources or their ability to have a professional doctor attend to the needs of her babies who passed away. My grandma had to experience so much trauma in her life. And it was due to those traumatic events that I'd imagine she felt like she needed something different. She needed to be somewhere different. She needed to see something different to have any reason to continue to want to live. Those aren't her words, but in me spending enough time trying to understand why people do what they do, I'm sure my grandma felt some sense of hopelessness when imagining what the rest of her life and her children's life would look like there in El Salvador. And so again, my grandma, like many others, made the decision to leave everything. And for those of you that don't know, And I say that because we're currently living during a time where it's very clear that a lot of people don't know what those sacrifices and what that experience looks like to even try to come to this country. There's not an airplane waiting for you to get on it to bring you here, at least not for most. There's not a Waymo waiting to pick you up outside your house to drive you here. For those that make that courageous, brave decision to leave everything, to come to the US, it looks like having to pay somebody, which the term is, if I'm not mistaken, a mule, to help them navigate the treacherous conditions, which include mountains, which include water, which include wildlife, just to try to get here. So many folks have passed away on their journey here. May they rest in peace. So many folks made it to the US only to be met by immigration and then be sent back. That was actually an experience my grandmother had. If I'm not mistaken, I believe she had shared with me that her first attempt to come to the US was successful and that she got here. But at some point, very quickly, she got caught up in a situation where immigration just happened to be in an area that she was in, and they round up all these people the way that cattle is round up. They put them in a truck and they sent them all back. In that moment, my grandma could have said, hey, I tried. I gave it my best shot. I tried to come to the US. It didn't work out. And just have accepted that her life was going to continue to exist in El Salvador under those very challenging conditions that she had lived her whole life. However, shout out Abuelita, she wasn't going to let that experience stop her from continuing to try to get here. Because clearly there must have been a deep, deep belief that she needed to be here in the US to have a reason to keep building, to keep going, to keep wanting to live, while somehow, some way doing whatever it took to then bring her children over here. What's interesting is when my grandma used to tell me those stories, man, how I wish she was here. She never did it looking for pity. She never did it looking for someone to say I'm sorry or just anything like that. She always had this very stoic face. She always had this like calmness and composure. And she would tell these stories as if it was so normal. I think a part of that, though, is because there was deep down inside a sense of pride that she was able to be so resilient in the midst of all that chaos, in the midst of all of those situations that very understandably so could have led her to just give up. My grandma, once here in the US, was able to find jobs of all sorts and was eventually able to get a majority of her kids here to the US, with the exception of one of my uncles, my tío Antonio, who I actually happen to be named after, who got caught up in the civil war that was going on in El Salvador and unfortunately passed away in some type of action, some type of battle that took place. May he rest in peace. And my grandma always felt so guilty for not having been able to convince him to come or have not sent for him a bit sooner before the Civil War started. And she always beat herself up for that. And she was, though, still very happy that she was able to bring her other children here and that they had an opportunity to have a different shot at life here. Another thing I just want to mention, though, is that when folks finally do get here, they don't always get here with any type of guaranteed shelter or home for them to live in. They don't get here with someone waiting to teach them the language and waiting to teach them the norms and the cultural practices of the US. So many of these people literally have to start from scratch. And my grandma had to start from scratch. Sometimes they might have a family member who had just came recently as well and might have shelter and can offer that for a short amount of time. But there's typically an understanding that at some point, each person has to figure it out and figure out how they're going to continue to navigate their lives here in the US. My grandma was beautiful. She was intelligent. She was strong. And she was so caring. I grew up without my dad. So it was my mom and my grandma who had the biggest responsibility in helping raise me, and my brother Andrew, and my sister Jasmine. My brother Andrew and my sister Jasmine have a different father than I do. And thankfully, their father was still actively in their lives. And so there were a good amount of moments in which my brother Andrew and Jasmine would head with their dad over the weekend because unfortunately, he and my mom didn't work out. And so oftentimes it left me alone. I had two siblings, but deep down inside, I always felt like an only child. And then my mom, due to being a single mother of three, oftentimes had to work 2 or 3 jobs. I can recall her coming home from work only to get a call that there were more hours available and she would head right back. And she did so because she too was strong. She too made so many sacrifices for my siblings and I, all in hopes of just being able to provide a roof over our heads, make sure we had enough food in the kitchen, and even if 3 or 4 of us slept on the same bed, at least have a bed to sleep on. And so shout out to my mom as well. And because of how busy my mom was, it was my grandma who was my primary caretaker and who was there for me through a lot of different stages in life, which included bullying, which included puberty, which included that of moments of me coming home crying, feeling very discouraged, feeling very hurt due to different things that were going on once I left my home. And it was always through her words that I was reassured that I was going to be okay. It was always through her actions that I knew that even if I had nobody else, she would always be there. My abuelita preached education, even though she didn't have it herself and didn't quite know how to help me within my educational journey. She preached resilience in different ways by sharing her stories in which she demonstrated resilience. And beyond both of those things, she poured so much love into me. My family had this saying that I was my abuelita's ojos, which in English translates that I was her eyes. And that saying within our cultures means that I was like her everything. That if anything happened to Antonio, if anybody looked at Antonio wrong or said anything to Antonio, she was quick to grab me and go. Because she did her absolute best to protect me under any and all conditions. Because I'd imagine she didn't want me to have to go through anything even close to the experiences that she went through. My abuelita is a huge reason why I not only pursued the many educational degrees that I did, but I did so wanting to make her proud. I did so wanting to honor her and her sacrifices and my mom's sacrifices. I did so wanting to be like her and use my experiences, use my voice, use the fact that I have another chance to live another day to give to others. Because that's what I saw her do. My grandma always just wanted to feel helpful. She took care of damn near 2 generations of children within our family, which included the children of cousins, of aunts, of uncles. And she did so without asking for much. She did so because it was clear that her life purpose was to help. And now at 34, as I've continued to navigate life professionally, personally, now as the father of 2, shout out Lilo and Luna, who are 3 years old and are my twin daughters, every day it just becomes clear and clear for me that the best way that I can honor my grandma and the best way that I can be everything she wanted me to be is by also helping people. And that's what brought me to create this podcast. Knowing that this is another avenue to try to touch the lives of people, to try to touch the hearts of people, to try to touch the minds of people, and hopefully give them some words of encouragement, some words of reassurance, some words of inspiration that can help them keep going regardless of what conditions or circumstances they're navigating. My grandma was resilient, she was strong, but she was also emotional. And I think having a good balance of those things where you can acknowledge the feelings that you're navigating, acknowledge those emotions, let them exist, let them breathe, and yet collect yourself so that you can keep moving forward. Seeing her do that time and time again, I think made me realize that no matter what was going on, I was going to be okay. And no matter what it was that I needed to confront, I'd figure it out. Even if that meant I didn't figure it out the first few times, there'd come a time where it would be figured out. And I thank my abuelita, who I wish was still here with me, who I miss every day, who I got tattooed on my leg and have a chance to see every day. I just thank her for believing in me in ways that I don't know if anybody else did. But I know that belief stemmed from the fact that she saw me grow up. She helped raise me. She helped instill so many of her values, so many of her morals into me. And I think me being her eyes also meant that I was like her mini me in a lot of ways. I'm passionate. I can be stubborn too, much like her. But I care so much. I care so deeply. And all I want to do is help people. And so there's so much more to my grandma, but I at least wanted to give a bit of that introduction of what she shared with me, of what she went through, and the courageous decisions that she made to come here to the US with no guarantee that it was going to work out. Nothing other than just a leap of faith that somehow, some way, the US, even as problematic as it is and as dysfunctional as it is, offered her and her family the best opportunity at trying to make something out of ourselves. I also want to acknowledge and mention that much of the reason why El Salvador is the way it is because of the US's invasion of the country physically, financially, and in many other ways. So let's not get it twisted. The US also contributed a lot as to why El Salvador was even in the condition that it was. But I digress. Just wanted to make sure I mentioned that. Because I'm not here telling you that the US is the best country in the world. I'm not going to say that. Because I think it's very clear that with where we are currently in 2025, many people, had they met my grandma when she first came here, would be asking to send her back. And that she didn't belong here. And I'm so thankful that my grandma, who I'm sure did encounter those moments, conversations, interactions, knew she belonged wherever she wanted to belong. And she's given me the faith and the power to know that I belong. I belong anywhere and everywhere that I can help. And so thank you for anybody who took the time to watch this from start to finish, or just watch a few of the clips that I'll most likely upload. My abuelita was my world, and I miss her dearly. And yet I'm so thankful that she's now resting in power, resting in peace, and that I get a chance to live on and continue to represent her in a way that I think she'd be proud. I love you, abuelita. Te quiero mucho. Te extraño mucho. Y ojalá estés orgullosa de mí y que yo pueda continuar de salir adelante como me decías, to keep going forward, and that I can just continue to help others in the way that you were so dedicated and committed to. Thank you, abuelita. And thank you, anybody who, again, watched this episode. See ya.